Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order, the Business Committee of May the 3rd. It's with great respect and humility that we acknowledge and honor the lands of the Snuneymuxw people. The Snuneymuxw people maintain their profound, unique, and spiritual connection to the land through ageless traditions, teaching, stewardship, and expressions of reciprocity. Do we have any additions to the deletions or changes in order to the agenda this evening? Seeing none, can I get a motion to approve the agenda? You could please type in the chat window.
Greg, I moved it. I'm not sure if you can see it.
I can't see anybody right now, actually.
I noticed.
And if I could ask that you please use the chat so that I can. My apologies. Can I ask that trustees please utilize the chat so that I know who is willing to move a motion? I'm just going to do a quick test here and make sure it's working. Okay, maybe our chat's not working this evening. So what we'll do is to ask the trustees who'd like to move the motion to turn their camera on, and we'll do it that way. So I see that Trustee Stanley would like to move the motion. Is that correct, Trustee Stanley?
Yes, please.
Thank you. And Trustee Barron would like to second the motion. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. For whatever reason, our chat doesn't appear to be working. But that's okay. We only have one item on the agenda this evening, and I'll pass it over to Secretary Treasurer Walsh for the 2021 and 2022 preliminary annual budget.
Yeah, hi. Good evening, everyone. Through you, Chair, I'm going to just introduce a little bit here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Treasurer Walsh. So, good evening. It is with both pride and relief, I think, we present the preliminary budget for the 2021-22 school year this evening. Many senior management teams around the province are not having quite the same conversation with their boards of education. Lots of them are grappling with cuts to resources at a time where we need more. And so we feel pretty fortunate this evening to be in the financial position we find ourselves in the Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools. While we're in a time of great uncertainty, this budget will allow us to continue to support our strategic plan and react to COVID-19 and plan for the future. This year's budget is an extension of last year's budget, which is an extension of the budget before that. And this board and the previous board have made many additions to staffing, to previous budgets. Of course, after years and years of declining enrollment and cuts and reduction in services. So we're maintaining all of those additions from previous budgets. I mention this because while we have few changes to this budget this year, we're building on all the budgets of the past. And the good news, I think, is that I believe we're moving in a good direction. So I just want to mention a few things that we'll be maintaining from previous budgets. So we'll continue to invest in reconciliation, supporting Hulkaminum in our schools, supporting continued operation of Quam Still Equal School. We'll continue to have a CASM, which is the Manager of Truth and Reconciliation. Just a little aside, I'd like to highlight maybe one of the things the manager did this year, and that was we had something called the Truth and Reconciliation Speaker Series. And as a public service announcement, I'll mention that Jody Wilson-Raybould will join us to talk about rebuilding Indigenous relations for a stronger Canada, and that's next Wednesday. We'll continue to maintain significant increases to child, youth, family support workers that the board put in place in 2018, 2019. We'll also maintain counseling levels at much higher than is required by the collective agreement. These staffing levels will directly support the mental health and wellness of our students. As we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic and continue our upwards trajectory of growth, we need to make sure that we focus on areas of need, particularly with respect to vulnerable learners. In this budget, you'll see us adding outreach teachers, child, youth, family support worker time, and a 23% increase to educational assistant time. This budget is focused on public confidence, consistency for our staff and students, and supporting our most diverse learners. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Treasurer Walsh to lead you through the budget document. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent, and through you, Chair. Chair, are you able to see that yet?
No, actually, our chat is not working this evening.
Okay,
So
sorry.
So we'll just have to play it by ear for the speakers list, but I'd ask that go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Sure, and Mr. Chair, I can see the chat on my system. So perhaps my hope was that we would get through the presentation and then respond to questions, unless you wanted to do it a different way. And then certainly I can curate the chat if that would assist you as well, because I assume that I'll probably be responding to the majority of the questions.
That sounds great, and thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I will hold questions to the end of the presentation.
Okay, Ms. Matthews, could you start on page 5 of the agenda, please? Great, if you could scroll down to the bottom of the page for me. Just want to recognize the board and the senior superintendent. I won't recognize myself here, but this evening, and ultimately just to state that this budget is built with this board's goals and the operational plans that staff has brought to the board over the last year as its guiding light. And to the superintendent's comments about how it is much a continuation of last year, which is definitely something that we aimed to do, as well as incorporating the changes that our community and board has wanted to see. And we'll highlight some of those issues this evening. So if you could turn to page 7, Ms. Matthews. And so I won't be touching on anything that's not in the agenda, but certainly want to touch on some highlights that we see and highlight the changes that the board may see. So just to start off from where this began, and so what we would say is that this process is an iterative process, but really we began the moment we finished the planning for the last preliminary budget. Of course, going to the end of the year, seeing our surplus, making some recommendations as to some areas of focus to spend that surplus on, which the board supported. And then starting to talk to our community about not only where the demands are, but actually how this whole process works. So how our formulas work to fund schools, how our departments are funded, how revenues work, etc. And we really appreciate all the questions and the feedback that's come from that process this year, and we anticipate repeating it next year. So we would say that this evening is the end/beginning of the process of the budget in the district. So we have been focusing on the last couple of months on the inputs into this budget. I'm going to go over them relatively briefly, but I think it's important that we are able to understand what has gone into this budget to get our assumptions. So again, we have created the budget based off of a relatively conservative enrollment estimate, not seeming as conservative as the numbers are bearing out at this point, because we still have some parents that are taking their time to make that choice and taking that time to enroll their students in the bricks and mortar schools. So we're happy that we made the decision to go on the conservative end. And what that does is it means that we're probably going to end up with more money than we're budgeting for right now, because as more students appear and the supports, we get more funding, and then more teachers are there and more support staff are there to support those students. And so this is a regular occurrence for us, and so we know that going in. And so, for instance, if we have a school and they get 10 extra students and there's not enough divisions in the school in September, this budget's not going to stop us from providing supports to those students. On the other hand, if those 10 students don't show up and we already had a teacher in that space, then we would have a financial impact on the bottom line of the district. International is, I would say, a highlight or a bright light for the district. We're seeing, and I think this is happening across the province, is a significant increase in interest this year in international. And perhaps it didn't go away, but certainly we see people that suppressed demand from COVID. We're seeing a heightened level of interest. We are being careful though. So we do think we're going to end up again with more students than we're budgeting from the international perspective. And again, staffing will go with them to support them if they show up. Importantly, and this is one that will impact schools, is we are holding back what we would say the profit or the extra dollars that those extra students bring into the district until we actually see them. So it's a bit of a let's be absolutely certain that they're here before we allocate those dollars. So there may be more funds that go to staffing in our secondaries to support those students when they do arrive. We've talked about our local revenues being relatively low, so interest rates, rental revenues, use of our gymnasiums, etc., being low due to COVID. When we started with our departments, and so with the exception of some of the changes we'll talk about briefly, our schools are maintaining their formulas. So the ratio of teachers to educators to students is the same. Counseling to students is the same. Clerical is the same, etc. Departments have all been budgeted on what we would call a status quo budget. But to be clear, status quo is not status quo. So if there's a member that's getting an increase because of their contract or because of their collective agreement, that will be incorporated, and we would still call that status quo in the circumstances. What we have not done is added extra dollars to budgets for supplies and services or additional staffing. So there are, however, some reallocations that we want to touch on. And one that we've talked about is that, again, not talking about additional dollars for the department, but reallocation by bringing some more services in-house, getting rid of redundant services in the contract world, and that's in IT. So we're recommending the creation of a manager position in IT. In facilities, so the board is supportive of maintaining all of our bus routes, and our transportation department was already in a bit of a deficit. So what we've always asked the facilities department to do is pay for their own vehicles on a yearly basis, which to us doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense given operating budgets and capital budgets should be different things. And so facilities has reallocated some of the funding, or we reallocated the facilities funding to cover off some of those areas of deficit. And in the event that facilities needs additional capital items, we would either access local capital that's available or come to the board and make recommendations about transfers to local capital for that purpose. And so a great example would be is if in September We have the opportunity to get an electric vehicle to replace an aging truck used by our electrical department. We'd come to the board and we'd say, board, we have a bit of a surplus. We're looking to reallocate those funds to local capital. Facilities will use those funds to purchase capital equipment, in this case, a truck, if that was the case. Again, those changes do not add to the budgets of either of the departments. They're just reallocations within them. Turning to page 8, if you're following along, again, we're looking at a slight increase in enrollment, predominantly at the secondary level, which will be reflected in the staffing that's going out to schools. And I think it's really important, and the superintendent did bring this up, is that as a district, the district has consistently supported counseling allocations to our secondary schools, particularly, that are significantly above what would be required by the collective agreement. And that's, of course, a conscious choice by the board. But on a year-to-year basis, I don't think that often it's pointed out that that is a choice that is being made. And again, positive choice being recommended to be maintained, but again, an expense for the board that they're able to continue to support in the budget. Similarly, in 2018-19, CYFSW hours were increased significantly by the board, which to a cost of nearly $500,000. I think schools would say they would like another $500,000 of that time, but again, being recommended to maintaining that increased allocation for staffing. The biggest change you'll see in the budget is the recommendation that an increase to the EA contingency budget of 7.35 FTE or 23%. And so this has been accomplished by reallocations within Community Link, as well as within the District Learning Services budget. And Mr. Davey will probably pop on here to just describe the purpose of the change, in addition to what is laid out there in the executive summary.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer, and through you, Chair. So the purpose of what we're looking at here is really, as has been pointed out, within a status quo mandate. What we're looking at is alignment of our recommendations going forward to specifically or significantly, I guess, 2 areas. And board strategic goals, the continuous improvement of instruction and assessment, and also the safe, caring, and healthy learning and working environment that is inclusive of the diversity of our entire learning community. And that's significant in terms of the small number of changes that we are putting forward here as a department. And what we're looking at is really 4 significant areas, but outreach supports or supports for students returning to our schools or returning to bricks and mortar schools is going to be a significant part of what we're looking at here, as well as just aligning our supports and services predominantly in the areas of educational assistance supports to the classrooms as our students are, again, returning to our classes post pandemic, and as we move into the next stages of educational support for these students. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer.
And one of the additional items to add, particularly with respect to the education assistance, is this is in response to, I think, the feedback that we've seen from the community as well as from our partners, but the direct impact of the proposed increase will mean 2 things. One, it will mean that there'll be less turnover at this time of year in our schools. So what happens is we say, okay, we anticipate that this year we had 100 students with diverse learning needs. Next year we're going to have 96 students with designations. But really, we know there's going to be more students with designations, or we already know there's students in schools that need additional supports, even if they're not designated. So we can't, though, provide consistency necessarily based off of the contingency that was there. And so by providing the additional contingency, we're able to put more hours now into schools. That's going to prevent, that EA from being laid off. We know they'll be rehired anyway, but prevent some from being laid off to maintain consistency. But the other big impact is that it'll also mean that they're there on day 1 in September. It's a big deal. And finally, is what that'll also do is it'll leave just enough contingency. So when that student that needs that help comes and arrives on September the 9th or the 10th or the 15th, etc., we're going to have that support. And, Ms. Steele and her team are going to be able to provide that support to schools in a really, so both a proactive way in the spring and summer, and then a reactive way in the fall, while we wait for additional designations to come in and funding to drive that. So we think that's going to have a real impact on some of that staffing concern that I think has been something consistently raised by this board, by our partners, by the community. You'll note a slight change at our Island Connect Ed. And perhaps again, I'd ask Mr. Davey just to describe the need and why we're proposing what we're proposing.
Thank you again, Secretary Treasurer, and through you, Chair, what we're looking at here for Island Connect Education is a reduction of a coordinator position that's assigned to the school and an increase in administrative support to the school in the form of a vice principal. What I can say at this point is that on average, we've had 450 students annually coming through the program, plus a significant number in just senior classes as students are coming through, so singleton classes coming through there this past year. As we're fully aware, we saw a massive influx in numbers during the pandemic, which has led to a recognition of need and undertaking of significant transformation on curricular alignment for our DL programs or distributed learning programs. And through this work, we have seen great success over the course of this past year, even during the COVID pandemic. But we recognize also there's a need for more administrative support to the school. The COVID pandemic has shone a light on DL models across the province, and no exception then to Island Connect Education. And again, a feeling of just strong leadership support that's required for our DL programs. Our projections for 2021-22 are roughly 595 students at this point. As the Secretary Treasurer has pointed out, we are seeing shifts almost on a daily basis in terms of those numbers, but that is the projection. And as noted earlier, just we continue to see hundreds of additional singleton courses in these senior grades. Another significant point is that to make here is that Island Connect Ed is a 12-month program, and with a single administrator, it's very hard to provide that continued administrative support and allow for contractual vacations and so forth for the administrator. And it's also important that we note, as we have schools that at the elementary level that are over 350 students, we are adding additional administrative support. And again, as I noted, just with full-time students, we're projecting 595 students. This is significant in the fact that this is a K-12 program. It's not a secondary number we're looking at here. We're looking at K-12. And the last point I'll make here is that really the coordinator roles are a holdover from the former Learn at Home days, and Island Connect Ed has really evolved, and it's recognized. It's in one building, and it's recognized more as a significant school. Obviously, the numbers would demonstrate that. And what we're seeing is a greater number of students who are benefiting from both online and face-to-face instructional supports through Island Connect Ed. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer.
And so also just want to go back briefly just for one moment. Mr. Davey was talking about the outreach programs to support our students who've been so impacted by COVID and being perhaps disconnected from our learning. And our board, I think, is rightly recognized as being prudent in budgeting and having, again, prudence in the sense that we've had a contingency, a staffing contingency of $1.5 million that we haven't had to access. Of course, we thought we would be accessing it this year, but ultimately provincial and federal funding were able to support us. This, however, the need for outreach is extraordinary. And again, it's temporary. And so we are proposing that rather than reallocating other budgets, as in cutting positions or funding from some other area, that for the purposes of that outreach, given its temporary nature, that we actually do access that contingency as part of the budgeting process. Well, we anticipate surplus at the end of the year that could theoretically replenish that contingency, and that's what we would encourage. What we don't want to do is be left in a position where we're not planning for support in the summer and in the fall for that outreach. So it is extraordinary in that nature, in that normally we wouldn't be proposing to use surplus for that particular purpose. And then finally, before we dig into some specific numbers, we've talked about, we have reduced the COVID federal and provincial funds, which has had a pretty large impact on the overall FTE in the district to decline. This was anticipated. However, we are anticipating that if we were to have to continue our cleaning regime at today's rate, it would cost approximately $1.5 million. We have not built this into the budget at this time, and we have not done so because, again, it would create a fairly significant deficit that we would have to go into programs to be able to fund. So we do again anticipate surplus, but more so, we also anticipate that if the government is going to require districts to be at a certain stage or have a certain level of COVID, cleanliness, etc., that they would be supporting it through their contingencies. So again, we don't want to come to the board and suggest that we have to cut a program or a position to be able to support something that ultimately really should be funded by the province. We anticipate that it will, or alternatively, we will look to use surplus for those purposes. And again, the $1.5 million, the idea is that we would be maintaining services of today's level. If we didn't need to, we don't spray every night, etc., those numbers could also come significantly down. So again, this is just a little bit of a guessing game on what our service level needs to look like in September, but it's at top of mind for when that surplus comes out. So Ms. Matthews, could you turn to page 9, please? As the superintendent mentioned, the strategic plan and the board's goals are at the forefront of all of our planning. I do encourage you, if you're interested, to have a look at the 2020-21 preliminary budget as well. And in that budget, we've got essentially every single dollar attached to a specific board goal. We didn't go through that process this year because we wanted to highlight where the changes were, and given that every single budget line is likely shifted just a little bit. So QP member gets 2%, the teacher gets 2%, so that means the program area is just a little bit more expensive. We thought we would refer to that document and then really highlight the changes. And again, the superintendent talked about the continued supports that this district, significant continued supports that this board has for CAETSIS, as well as to support reconciliation and our Aboriginal learners. Will you turn to page 11, Ms. Matthews? So And you scroll down just a little bit more, 2 numbers here I want to highlight. Our enrollment projections, if indeed 23-24 is going to be 15,000, we're going to be in a very comfortable position, we hope, based off of the way the formula currently works. So again, you know, you see some of your colleagues across the province facing some challenges. When your enrollment declines, that it has a big impact on your operations. If your enrollment is increasing or even stable, slightly like ours this year, you're in a much better position. And before we go to the next page, just scroll down just a little bit more for me. I just want to highlight the fact that the completion rate in 2019-20, just again how positive that was. And the trajectory of the district is in a very good place. So we're going to get into the numbers here a little bit, and of course I'll be happy to jump back when the questions come. But I will start on page 19. I'm just going to highlight a couple of the changes. So Community Link is one of the areas where we're proposing to fund our goals through a reallocation of funding. And so if you just scroll down to the notes, Ms. Matthews. So Community Link revenue is essentially stable, but what we're proposing to do is reallocate 2 school food program positions to support our increased EA contingency. Essentially, all the funding would go directly to that. And Mr. Davey, I don't know if you want to jump on and talk just a little bit about that proposed change. The idea would be to align our district so the practices in every school is similar, but maybe you want to jump on and just speak a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer, and again, through you, Chair. Just in terms of these positions, and as Secretary Treasurer Walsh pointed out, the recommendation here is for the reassignment of 2 school food program planners, and the positions there. Really, what this would do is place these resource personnel closer to the classroom. Provide equity and alignment across our schools in terms of these school resources, and in essence, it also reduce redundancy of support, and I'll speak to that in a moment. From a budget standpoint, these are 2 held over positions, as has been pointed out in the document here from previous budgets, and through the department, we're looking at better utilization to support the board's strategic goals based on present needs. And I'll also add that, and as I spoke to earlier, the child and youth family support workers, as has been mentioned, were added to each school through the budget process in 2018-19. And from a food security standpoint, child and youth family support workers are working with the Nanaimo Lady Smith Schools Foundation and other community supports in terms of supporting breakfast and lunch services to students across our district. And what we're seeing now is a increase of support through the foundation and into our schools directly, from a total of 16 schools pre-pandemic to all schools presently. And again, that work is supported both by the foundation, but also through the resource and personnel that we have in the form of child and youth family support workers in our school. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I'll turn it back over to you.
And Ms. Matthews, could you turn to page 23? And if you just scroll down to the column at the bottom. So board, this is, or Madam Chair, this is the general overview of the changes. And so there's a couple that are really worth just understanding. So if you'll see the 4th and 5th from the bottom, or actually the 3rd, 4th, and 5th from the bottom, are all COVID related expenses. So the rapid response team that our district has received funding for. We won't receive funding for that next year, but we also won't have any expenses associated with it. The provincial COVID and the federal COVID funds, again, you'll see that later, and we've talked about this, is that we haven't anticipated that funding, and the FTE associated with that funding, teachers and support staff, has been backed out of the budget. And the one that I think is important to note is the Classroom Enhancement Fund, which is the very top of the column. You'll see it's lower than the previous year, and that's based off of the ministry's expectation that we only can budget for 90% of our anticipated CEF allocation. So this is a bit of a problem, I will say, from secondary and elementary this year, is that we think we know what we need in September, but we can't budget it right now. And if you can't budget it, you cannot staff it, which has a direct impact on our schools. So, you know, when the time comes to talk about whether the CEF gets rolled into the block, if it was, this is be one of the issues that we would probably be able to solve. So as it stands, though, right now, high schools are currently building their timetables, and they're ensuring that they're going to build timetables with the idea that there'll be more funding in September. However, they're going to create classes without teachers is essentially what they're doing. So timetables that meet their needs, but aren't necessarily completely staffed. And we have told our partners at the NDTA the way that this is functioning. It's somewhat similar in elementary, in that, again, we anticipate that number is not going to be minus $1.294 million from the previous year. We anticipate that it'll be at least 12 million or perhaps more. So it is a little bit of a hiccup, but certainly we cannot budget money that we do not have. So if you could turn to the next page. So again, we're going to go these are the impacts from the changes that we're suggesting. And so just it's there for everyone to see. And so this school food program planner, you'll see the EAs by surplus, which would have been last year, and if they're surplus funded, they don't continue. And then the funds that are moved over into EA hours from the savings. And then, of course, the COVID funding has an impact as well. So all those negatives are, we, I think, have said from the beginning, we anticipated not having these positions, but there's the direct impact from CUPE. And if you scroll down just a little bit more, Ms. Matthews. There's the impact, there's the changes again, Classroom Enhancement Fund change, COVID funding change. And the notes just describe what we've been talking about. So get you to turn to page 25, if you could. And so just as background, and the board, we've seen this a number of times over the last couple of months, and it's just the change to our revenue based off of our rates and based off of our anticipated enrollment. And so that's there for you. And page 29, if you would. So here are the changes on the expense side and the in the operating fund. And so here's, I think, just this gives you a sense of the ebbs and flows from year to year in how we're budgeting. So our increased revenues and then our decreased revenue or increased expenses, decreased revenues, increased revenues. Really, the highlight here is that the bottom 6 are really important to note. So you'll see restricted surplus allocation. And so we've been talking about that with respect to the $500,000 that the district or that the board approved moving forward to budget. And so you'll see again the bus monitor pilot program. There's some bargaining costs we're looking to allocate there because again they're one time. You don't want to add that to your permanent budget. Summer outreach program is in there. Painting program is there, and then the outreach program for the fall. And again, you'll notice that is more than 500,000, but that's what we're talking about. Extraordinary, using our staffing contingency for the amount that's above the 500,000. And then the ISC surplus out of the contingency, so 540,000, that's money that if those students actually arrive, that'll be above and beyond the expenses associated with them, and then the board will have access to those funds. I will say secondary schools certainly have an anticipation that there'll be additional blocks to support those students, as there has been in previous years. So when we come back to the board, if all those students arrive, we may not have that entire amount because some of it might have already been provided to secondaries, but the board would certainly have the opportunity to use some of that surplus for its immediate goals, environmental, reconciliation, for supporting students. If I could get you to turn to page 31, please. So I think an important number to see is just the year-over-year staffing that we have. I do want to point out that despite the fact that we are promoting or suggesting an increase to our EA contingency, you typically will see a decline in EAs from year to year, from the final amended budget of the previous year to the preliminary budget of this year, because again, we are going to have kids that aren't designated and don't have resources supporting them yet. So typically the amended budget is higher than the preliminary budget of the following year. But if you do flow down, I think it's just really important to see the number of the increase in this district over the past 7 years or 6 years. So Ms. Matthews, could you just go to the bottom of that page? So again, some of that, of course, is the CEF supporting staffing. Some of it is, and much of it is enrollment as well. So I just wanted to hit the highlights so we have plenty of time to respond to questions. And before we do go there, the one thing I do want to say is you will see this item is on the agenda on Wednesday evening at the education meeting. We don't have a specific presentation with respect to Wednesday envisioned, because what we are looking to do is to be able to give the board tonight, we'll be asking questions, of course, and then over the next few days, members of the public, you'll be looking through this document after this presentation and your questions are responded to. We assume with additional questions to be able to influence your decision making as we move forward. Then we would be proposing to go to the business committee, the regular business committee of this month, with a recommended motion to allow 3 readings at the board meeting and pass the final budget at the board meeting at the end of May. So again, thank you very much, and I just want to acknowledge our partners, particularly CUPE and NDTA. We've had a really great opportunity to hear their concerns and be able to present some information to them. And I know we don't always agree on everything, but just really appreciate that dialogue. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. Just for general public and fellow trustees, I'm stepping in as chair. There's been some tech issues for Chair Keller. So I can see we've got Mr. Sphere on the speakers list. So I invite you, Mr. Sphere, to come forward with your question. Mr. Sphere might also be having some tech issues, and I see Chair Keller is testing the system, so he may be back. until he confirms that with me, I'm going to move along. Mr. Spear, I will come back to you, or you can type out your question if it's a problem of getting up on the screen. Oh, there we go. And then we'll jump back to Trustee Stanley. I see you have a question. Mr. Spear. You are muted. Okay. How about we jump Trustee Stanley, and we'll come back to you, Rob. Okay, Mr. Spear. Trustee Stanley.
Thank you, Chair O'Neill. I'm hoping that I don't sound like a mouse, which have been my traditional technical problems, and I'm wondering what we've done to upset the technical gods, because it's been quite the night, especially for poor Trustee Keller. I will say I have a number of questions for this evening, but I'm going to start off with a really straightforward one just to ensure my understanding of the Community Link Fund. So when we make changes to the Community Link Fund, or how we allocate those funds, are there restrictions on that? So when we make changes, whose decision is that when changes are made to how the Community Link Fund is allocated?
Sure. So through you, Madam Chair. So I'm going to get Ms. Sutton, who might have the technical guidelines in front of her, but there are certain restrictions on the use of that fund, and I'm giving her just a moment while I delay to maybe bring up the instructions for the exact purpose. But certainly the Learning Services Department does have a great influence on how those funds are used to support vulnerable learners. So you'll see that community link budget, the way that it's currently laid out, probably is nowhere near what it looked like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when there was different priorities for boards or different restrictions from the ministry. So I would anticipate that the CYFSWs have probably increased as the need in mental health has become such a fundamental aspect. And I would imagine that the school foods program planners, for instance, have probably decreased over the years. But Ms. Sutton, do you happen to have the actual guidance there or a description?
I do not. I'm sorry to say, through the chair. What I have is basically the information that's provided within the budget presentation itself, as that is pulled from the ministry website. I don't have a document that suggests what the directive is. I believe actually that Learning Services has parameters that are more when it comes to reporting, that they need to report back what it's been spent on, but it's in support of our vulnerable students. So I'm not sure that there is particular parameters. We would have to get back to you on that.
So the definition on the top of page 19 is fairly specific description. But we can get the guidance document if the ministry has something and share it with the trustees.
I have a follow-up, Chair.
Follow-up, yeah, Trustee Stanley, please. Just to take the minute to unmute myself. Thanks. Yep.
Follow-up. I have a more specific question that is my real question, and so maybe this will allow us to address that. So I asked the previous question because in our agenda package, there's a variety of references about how, for example, the community school coordinators used to be funded under Community Link, but are no longer funded under Community Link. And so I just wanted to understand, that's an example, but there's, we've talked about the food planners as well. I just wanted to understand or ensure my understanding that that is a decision that is made by the district in how we choose, or various districts, and choose in how they choose to allocate those funds, and not as a result of an external body requiring those changes.
Yes, through you, Madam Chair, yes, that is the case. So for instance, the move of the community school coordinators to the operating fund in this district was a choice because the community link budget hit its maximum at some point, I assume. And so the board determined that it would continue to fund those positions outside of Community Link. They could fund them from within Community Link. Then something in Community Link would have to be funded from outside. But yes, that is the board ability to make that decision.
Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. I see that Mr. Zvier, QP, may be ready to pose a question.
Thank you. Doing that, it's a long one. I'll put them both together because if you look on there, there is 4 positions up for, I guess they would say, impact outside of the COVID ones. And if you already look at it, our total staffing change in COVID is about 26 FTE. And we recognize that, which didn't put this board in a difficult because we didn't place everybody as a regular full-time employee, even though they've been employed for the full year almost. But those jobs come at a cost of roughly $198,000, give and take probably a little bit less. And, you know, I've been crunching the numbers and trying to say through the, you know, Secretary Treasurer, it's not a lot of money to find in a big $145 or $162 million budget in the end, or even higher when you put everything together. And we find that the 2 schools where the school foods program planners are at were high need schools and have always fought to maintain those programs. And that's why they're some of the last 2 that have remained. Most of the other ones were cut during the time when we were in a default and we had to give up certain jobs to maintain them. Those people may not have positions to land in. It sort of puts me in this awkwardness. And we also talked about the community school coordinators where we were just getting them back online and they've never had room to breathe, and COVID sure didn't add any fun to their day. But in the end, they all participated in a role and helped the district out in needs outside of their normal positions to help them get through the COVID, which we thank, because normally people would be not doing that, but that was a manageable piece. So I do ask the Secretary Treasurer.
I'm going to ask you to get to the question because
the question is that it's not a large amount. We know that the surplus is going to be fairly big. And I know that there's another pot of money in there that never comes to the table, and that's the benefits premium holiday that if the district could, they have the opportunity to use some of that money as a surplus and take the money that they would pay into that plan that they could actually utilize to save other positions at certain times. So that's my question is, has the board exhausted their venue and are these jobs necessary for the cut?
Secretary Treasurer Walsh.
Through you, Madam Chair. So certainly, again, I think we've talked about how we agree that we do anticipate an end of the year surplus. And of course, we're very, very wary about making any recommendation that would fund a program on an ongoing basis from surplus. So that's why you're unlikely to see a recommendation on that basis unless there's a long-term plan to maintain them. With respect to the benefits holiday, haven't contemplated using any of those funds to potentially look at, again, balancing a budget to a certain extent. Again, if we're in a place where those funds are required, that's a kind of a last resort kind of measure to review. And I guess just with respect to the 198, I think what I would say is that if the district was able to pull together 198,000, it would probably invest in more counseling time, more EAs, more CYSFWs. And so we like to really focus on the goals that are currently before the board and align with that. So, you know, there's no doubt. I mean, one of the ways to find $198,000 would be to not increase the EA contingency by 7.5. So it's definitely a choice there to be able to support board goals. So I guess, can we find it? Yes, because we found it's a reallocation, but we're not recommending using one-time funds to support it on an ongoing basis.
Follow-up, Mr. Spear?
No, that answers the question. I mean, there is money, but it is based on what the board decides on how they want to spend it. So thank you.
Thank you. I have Miss Wood with the NETA on the speakers list next. Miss Wood, would you like to ask your question? I like to delay a bit, give people a chance to unmute on video and all that jazz. Okay. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and hopefully I've lost connection about 4 times this evening, so hopefully it doesn't happen in the middle of my question. My question is from page 17, and it's related to the Classroom Enhancement Fund. So what I understood was that secondary schools would have blocks allocated for what we're expecting for Classroom Enhancement Fund, but not necessarily teachers assigned. However, when I look at the allocations there, I'm seeing elementary staffing at 8.59 less than this year. So it looks like the 90% is coming out of elementary staffing, and certainly the information that's provided in the paragraph underneath the 2 tables is talking about a temporary reduction of 8.59 FTE teacher staffing until the fall. So I'm questioning, are we thinking that elementary schools are going to be reorganizing in September when they get additional staffing?
So
that's my question.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm going to ask Ms. Sutton if she could come on and just overview when we anticipate that when we see those students to confirm them when that staffing would get issued.
Thank you through the chair. So the elementary had additional classrooms in it per the September 30th LOU and the staffing required at that time. That per projections is not going to be required in the class. Well, per projections at this time won't be required. When we see, so they've been removed. When we see what the actual staffing is in September, again, then they will be added if they're necessary. Secondary wasn't changed. They were left with the allocations that they had. And so no increase, no decrease, and then they will determine their needs going forward and timetable, but not staff yet. Does that answer your question?
Well, Ms. Sutton, could you comment on when you anticipate that? So let's say we have a school that has 10 divisions this year, and because of CEF, we have now given them right now 9 because we can only do 90%. But we all of a sudden see the students in August and we realize that we can support that CEF, we'll get funding for them. When would we issue that staffing for that 10th division?
So, and to confirm, when we built the budget and allocated the divisions and the staffing out, we did so by looking at the restored language and the class or and the School Act language to determine what projected enrollment would dictate divisions would be allocated out as. Then we will see what our actual enrollment is. Generally speaking, we try to look close or late in June when we have a fairly good idea as to what schools' enrollment will look like prior to September. If we can add divisions earlier than September, we would like to do that. Right now, we're having difficulty with our enrollment because families are unsure. And so enrollment is a little off what it normally looks like this time, but June, I would say that is when we would look to try, late June, to try to add divisions if necessary in anticipation or before September additions per the language.
Follow-up, Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. I just want to clarify. So the 8.59 FTE teacher staffing that is based on the 90% holdback for the CEF is affecting elementary and not secondary. That's what I'm understanding?
The elementary divisions assessed on projected enrollment and assessed on projected designations netted that difference that we couldn't justify in the annual budget, and so therefore they were removed. And that is in part why ministry doesn't fund the full 100%, because your needs are not going to be the same from one year to the next. So they want you to get to your actual needs in September. So elementary was reduced because they had such great need last year. And then where we need to add it back in September, we will do so.
Okay.
So I can add to that as well. So Ms. Wood, you'll recall that the number, the 90% number that we have this year is actually 90% of the previous year. So like a quote unquote normal year. And so when the COVID staffing or when the COVID impact hit us, I think that's why that the secondary number didn't increase in September like you would normally anticipate it to. So really that's the number that you're seeing for secondary staffing is really 90% of 2019-20.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move down the list and I'll invite Trustee Brezovich. And just a news update while Trustee Brezovich gets to the screen. I'm going to pass the chair back over to Chair Keller once this question and answer is complete, okay?
Thank you, Trustee McKay. Am I?
O'Neill, but that's okay.
O'Neill, I apologize. My goodness.
I don't mind being confused with Ms. McKay.
Yes, thank you. Through you to Mr. Walsh or whoever can, it might actually be Mr. Davey. The positions, the food planners. Can you, I was looking for and didn't have time to track down like a sort of a summary of the job description of what those positions were doing. And I'm just wanting to understand that because I'm curious how that work will get done and who will be doing that work. I just can't envision adding more work to people than we've already got.
Yes, Mr. Walsh, would you like to go ahead?
I see Mr. Davey there, Chair. If you can maybe start,
please.
I can add.
Well, actually, if I may, Mr. Walsh, before you start, I'd just like to thank Trustee O'Neill for chairing. I had a pretty significant technical error issue on my end, and also thank Ms. Matthews and our IT staff, Mr. Merchant, for helping me to get back up online for now. So I can breathe a sigh of relief for the moment. I do note that for whatever reason, Teams has been a bit of a problem for a few of us this evening. And so I just, again, apologize and thank everyone for their patience.
All right.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, to respond to the question, I don't have a copy of a job description in front of me here, so we can ascertain to get that for you and yes, to be able to provide a more fulsome response. I'll go back to the point that I made earlier, and that is that with the decision around budgeting and increasing the number of child and youth family support workers assigned to our schools, so it's essentially one per school at this point, and that decision was made back in 2018-19. As it's been noted through the budget process, the recommendation is to continue that significant level of support through CYFSWs to the elementary schools. And what we've noted is that all other schools in the district, and as I mentioned through the Nanaimo Smith Schools Foundation and other agencies who are providing support in terms of food security to our district and to our, more significantly, I guess, to our families and our students, we're able to meet the needs of those students. So these standalone positions, and again, there are two, there are other schools in our district that have similar needs in terms of socioeconomic needs and other needs for food security supports, and we're able to meet the needs within those schools within the structures that we have. So this is where we feel that these particular positions at this point, the duties can be supported in other manners.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep considering that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davey. Trustee Brzezinski, did you have a follow-up for Mr. Davey?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. So just thanks, Mr. Davey. So moving on our speakers list, I have Trustee Stanley followed by Trustee Barron. So go ahead, Trustee Stanley.
Hi. So I've got a question. I just realized my camera's kind of off. I've got a question for the about the community school coordinator positions, and I just want to, I'm not understanding why this is coming to the board again. So I want to just kind of lay out what I understand the history to be before I get to my questions, because that matters. So from my perspective, it's come forward every year that I've been here, and it's come forward in years before that. The board's made the decision on this, or had multiple conversations, and at the time there was really strong community support expressed for these positions. There was an external consultant that was hired to do a report that resulted in significant restructuring of the positions, and there was an expectation that there was going to be a report that was evaluating the success of that restructuring. COVID came along, and that seriously impacted the ability to, to fulfill that restructuring, from my understanding. And therefore, the report that we received wasn't really able to address the restructuring and whether that or not that was a good decision. It was more about how is it functioning now in the COVID restructuring. So what I'm not understanding is, it feels like, as I said, there's been multiple board conversations on this, and we made a decision to evaluate, to go forward with this restructuring and then evaluate the success of that. But I don't feel like we've gotten the information on that. What I want to know is, so I'm surprised it's coming forward again, because multiple conversations, restructuring report didn't get, I'm getting there, hold on.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know. So I don't know why we keep getting this, and so I'm really confused, right? Like, why is it, how will this, like somebody said, a board member said, it seems like somebody's out to get the community school coordinators. So why are we repeatedly coming to this change or this request to eliminate, reduce these positions? What is believed to be the impact to students? Why are we getting this again? Because obviously I'm assuming there's supposed to be an impact or a benefit to students. So can we please have a conversation about why there's this kind of what feels like repeated push to eliminate these positions and reallocate the money? And I really want to know this, like, from a learning perspective, from an educational perspective, from a student support perspective. Could we get a discussion about the pros and cons of having this position versus spending the money? I know it's supposed to go to EAs, but why is there more perceived benefit in that position than the benefit of the community school coordinators, especially given that a lot of their administrative duties have been pushed out of the way, which should allow them to do more direct work that would benefit students and families? So help me understand why this keeps coming up and why is it here again, so I can make a decision on this, please.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. Mr. Walsh, did you want to take a stab at that one, or Mr. Davey, or?
Give that to Mr. Davey.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer, and through you, Mr. Chair. What I can say about this position, first of all, based on information that staff have received, we believe that there's going to be vacated positions for the community school coordinators. So we believe anything that's coming forward in terms of reallocation of the positions can be eliminated through attrition. Again, preliminary information, but this is information received by staff. We also believe that placing these resource personnel closer to the classroom is going to have a greater impact and greater benefit to students, and direct impact on the classroom. It's been mentioned through Trustee Stanley that we're looking at educational assistance, and specifically I can state at this point that we are looking at, we've mentioned increased educational assistance. There is a need for a Brailleist educational assistant within our system, and so that would be the reallocation of position. We'd be looking to add a person who has specialist skills to be able to support our students who require these supports. And as has been noted already, just through the mental health supports, we recognize that there are going to be significant needs for families who are returning to either the bricks and mortar school or in some cases returning to our schools. And we've got students who we're aware of, who we're working with and reaching out to through our outreach supports presently, but we have students who will, come September, not have been attached to a classroom for 17 months and are returning to our schools. And that's where, when we look at the needs of students and the mental health needs, students returning, I would suggest who have been impacted by the trauma of this COVID pandemic, having greater supports in the form of educational assistance, outreach teachers, outreach child and youth family support workers, and so forth. This is where the needs are identified. So again, we're not looking at necessarily the elimination of positions and people not being able to have meaningful employment within our school district, but we are looking at where we determine the greater needs are right now, and also the fact that possibly there are individuals who will be looking to return to their previous position of training, and that's either an educational assistant or a child and youth family support worker, and that would be a preferred position for some of the individuals, again, through understanding, who are presently in these positions.
Thank you, Mr. Davey and Secretary Treasurer Walsh. Trustee Stanley, did you require a follow-up? Thank you, Trustee Stanley. So next on our list is Trustee Barron.
Thank you, through the chair. Lots of good information coming forward today, and Trustee Stanley did address some of the questions that I had, and so maybe I will just fine tune a little bit my question around it and some thoughts that I had. I appreciate the responses and some. So a few things. First of all, as a trustee, I was looking for a report that provided meaningful information around the status of the community school coordinators and how the new portfolios and how the restructuring of the positions was going in order for us to determine how to move forward. That was my understanding of our last discussion around this. And so without that, I'm trying to understand how to make the best decision around the benefits to the students. Because for me, it sounds like we're creating a discussion around which role is most important, when in fact we're not comparing apples to apples. They're very different positions that benefit students differently. To say that an EA position is more important than a community school coordinator position or vice versa, I don't think is addressing what it is that we need to be talking about, because one is generalizing, of course, very much responding to immediate student needs, whereas the other one is very much proactive in ensuring that students can show up in the classroom and receive the enriched education that they deserve. And so I don't feel like we can say that one is more important than the other. I'm trying to understand where the report is around this for me to make a decision around this. And then I have so much to say around this that I'm just going to narrow it down. My first question is around the report. Will we be receiving a report for us as a board to be able to make informed decisions around the impacts or potential impacts on students on us reducing 5 community school coordinators to 2 community school or 3 community school coordinators? I apologize. Thank you.
Superintendent, sorry, give you a little bit of promotions there, Mr. Walsh.
No, thanks.
Over to you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh.
Sure. Thank you, and perhaps Mr. Davey will want to come in a little bit. And through Mr. Chair, I do believe that the presentation to the Education Committee was intended to address not only the COVID impacts of the change, but as well as the kind of focus on an ongoing basis and some of the more permanent changes with respect to those positions. So I don't know if I can add any more to that. I mean, guess maybe what I would suggest is that if the board proceeds with the recommendations, is that next year we come back and talk about what that impact is, because the reality is that given COVID, we may not, even if the positions are maintained, is that we're maybe looking at something different for half the year or more in any event with respect to those positions. So if the board does decide to proceed with the recommendations of staff in this front, there would be nothing that would stop the board from saying, okay, well, what have the impacts been from the move from 5 to 3, and then the board can then say, okay, well, we want them back, or you know, given the fact that we have increased enrollment, there could be an opportunity for that. But again, I think the Education Committee report was intended to address both COVID as well as the general efficacy of the way that the program is currently built. But maybe Mr. Davey can add to that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Treasurer, thank you for your response, and nothing further to add to that.
Well, I see Superintendent Saywell pop up. Would you like to speak, Scott?
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Chair. Well, I appreciate that at least a couple trustees now have spoken to a report. The Learning Services Department did present a report on March 3rd, Education Committee meeting on the Community Schools Coordinator update. And I've heard it a couple times now that trustees aren't appreciating the how comprehensive that report is, but we did have a report, and we did answer questions based on that report. So there won't be another report coming on the Community Schools Coordinator. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Saywell. Trustee Barron, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the clarification through to our superintendent. I guess just a statement quickly. Based on the fact that right now we're in a time where we need more now than ever positions that have flexibility and that have the ability to meet the needs of our students during a pandemic, and that both the food coordinator positions and the community school coordinator positions are actually in prime positions to be able to do much of the work that we have moving forward. We've seen that the needs of our students are complex and diverse. We don't know what's coming, and I feel that it would be detrimental to our students to be cutting these positions. And so just as an individual trustee, I will not be supporting cutting these positions. I'm very much opposed, and unless I have information that speaks to the educational value to students of doing so, I would like to share that that's where I stand on that right now. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Barron. So we'll move on down the list to Trustee McKay. Go ahead, Trustee McKay.
Thank you. So I have a number of thoughts based on the presentation this evening. First, I'd like to thank everyone that worked on the, I guess it's 31 pages, the 31-page report that's been put together, including the executive summary on the budget this year. And so I've given, I've reviewed it quite a bit. I've looked at recommendations, I've reviewed prior reports, and I've considered the last few years, several years, in fact, of what budgeting has looked like over time in School District 68. And I think that budget time is probably the hardest time of the year for school board trustees, because we have to determine what we're going to do with the allocations that are given to us in our operating budget. What I see this year in this budget is a couple of things that are a little bit different. I see the creation of positions that result of finding efficiencies in the system. I think that that's fiscally responsible. When I think about the IT position in particular, there's no additional cost to the operating budget. There's no additional funds needed to create that position, and yet that position will fulfill needs that have been identified by students, needs that we know our staff say we need to be looking at in schools in order to become more efficient. And so I appreciate that. When I look at other positions, for example, the community schools coordinator, that seems to be the hot topic of the evening, I find myself a little bit frustrated by the idea that we have not heard a report back. I have the report in front of me from March 3rd. There are 4 areas that were identified in that report of efficiencies that have been created over the past few years. Everything from web-based instructions to school administrators who are managers in our system actually being the ones responsible for community outreach, which I think is appropriate. Managers and administrators in the school district should be the ones that are sitting at appropriate tables. The position of manager of mental health and addictions. When we first started out with community school coordinators, that was something that had never been thought of. And so a lot of the administrative tasks, rightfully so, sit with the appropriate people that are responsible for those types of decisions. And in doing that, we've created efficiencies and reduced workload. And with a reduced workload across 5 positions, if staff are coming to us and recommending that there is a reduction in staff required or potentially to be considered in order for us to make other decisions like providing students in or providing supports in classrooms, adults in classrooms to support student learning, that is significant. Every single time we have an adult in a building that wasn't there before is a good thing. If we're pulling, I guess what I'm saying is that the recommendation for me is that if we can create efficiencies in the system that pull people out of offices and put staff members into buildings with students, I'm very supportive of those types of decisions. And I appreciate the reports that have come forward so far. I look forward to hearing further later this week from our NDTA and QP, who have planned presentations at the Education Committee, and to hear more about the learning aspects of things. But so far, I appreciate the budget the way it's been presented, and I'm very supportive of the where we're moving. So I thank staff for the work.
Thank you. I'm not sure there was a question in there, but that's okay.
Chair, I'd like to respond. When there's a staff report, there is not required under our school district policies to ask a question as a trustee. Comments are acceptable within our policy. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to Trustee Stanley.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I know in the chat I put question, but I'm gonna continue on this conversation. Before I go on to later on, I'll ask for another question. So to clarify, when this issue of a report, I know that we received a report March 3rd, but it wasn't a report that we had previously discussed. I expected to receive, which was to evaluate the efficacy of the restructuring of the positions. So that's the report that, I mean, I know we got information about changes, but we haven't received the information about the restructuring of the positions. And so that's the piece that I'm looking for. But I recognize COVID kind of mucked with that. I do have, with regards to the cuts of the number of positions, I mean, at the root of my questions are, how is this going to impact kids and kids' ability to function in schools? And I don't feel like I've gotten that information. So I'm going to kind of veer into one aspect of that, and I'm going to stay on the community school coordinators, even though I actually, and I'll save my food ones later. But so my background is in trauma, right? My PhD was in trauma, and the core piece of recovering from trauma, especially at a community disaster level, which is indeed the situation that we are in, is the community coming together and supporting one another. That's one of the core ways that communities and people cope when there are major disasters, which COVID kind of falls under that category. So when I hear that we're expecting that there's going to be an impact from the trauma of COVID that's going to come into our schools, I do recognize that that's a significant concern. But I do also see and there's kind of a question here, but I don't think we'll get an answer yet. But my concern is this, is that from the community school coordinator position of offering services that the community students could participate in which would create an enhanced community connection, I see there are a lot of value in that from that trauma perspective. So, and I also see, based on that March 3rd report, that given that a number of the administrative tasks that have been reduced, that the community school coordinators in theory, in doing their positions as intended, should have more time to do that. So more direct work with regards to programming for students and community members. So this is where my question is, but I guess I acknowledge that it's a big question and I don't expect staff would have an answer right away. So I'm kind of throwing that out there. This is a major consideration for me in my decision-making process, which is when we talk about meeting student needs and mental health needs, one thing I wouldn't mind is a discussion of the benefit support of, from an educational assistant perspective in the classroom, which is also important, versus the value of the community school coordinators in enhancing community connections and well-being from that more general community well-being level. That's kind of the crux of the decision that we're being asked to make, and I feel like I'm stuck in not having enough of a discussion or information on that. So I see Mr. Saywell has popped up. I don't know if staff are ready to do that now, but I do want to throw that as a, hey, can we at some point in time get that piece of information?
Thank you, Trustee Stanley, and I see Superintendent Saywell is on the screen.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that. It's difficult to ascertain one job's value over another. So I'll just explain a little bit about where this trying to allocate resources in a way that, although even our strategic plan took a little bit of a turn during COVID, and so I appreciate you acknowledging that, and the value of each one of those positions is immense. I agree. In that summary from March 3rd, however, it did give a few ways or reasons why we think we can reduce somewhat, because the job has changed a bit over time. So, but I just wanted to speak to what we're trying to do, and that is to get resources closer to the classroom. So the board has certain objectives that we're trying to meet, like improving opportunities for early intervention and learning. We think more EAs in the system can help do that. Increasing awareness and capacity in supporting children and youth in care. We think more EAs in the system can help do that. Another objective that the board would like to see realized is increase the number of students who feel there are 2 or more adults at their school who care about them. We think adding more EAs into the system, 23% more, can help that. Increasing awareness and capacity in addressing mental health and wellness. We think putting more staff members closer to the students in schools in the EA role can help us do that. In the end, I appreciate trustees have to grapple with this decision, and it's a difficult decision. I'm not sure we can play off which job is more important than the other right now, because you've brought up some really good points. I appreciate those as well. But that's our thinking around trying to get supports closer to the classroom. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Saywell. Trustee Stanley, do you need a follow-up?
No, but I really appreciated that explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving on down the list, next is Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. I do have a question on something that I'd like to see, but just because this is a conversation that's happening, and I've heard a couple of comments that I feel like I need to comment on, and one is this notion that perhaps people are out to get community schools coordinators. And as someone who has been around even longer than Trustee Stanley here talking about this role, I am reminded of the history of this position as well, that community schools coordinators were originally funded by an external grant. A school was designated a community school, particularly because it was intended to take this was the wording at the time, one of the most underutilized public facilities, and increase the value of the investment by keeping it open on evening, weekends, and summers to address the needs of all ages in the community, preschool to adult education, with the use of prevention-based programming. So it was originally funded by an external grant. That grant stopped. I think it got at some point, I think it got rolled into Community Link, and our school district has tried a long time to hold on to these positions. So they just kept them for a while at the schools. And you know, I remember our community schools coordinator based in the schools in my community, and it was an excellent position that did sort of do exactly what that program, what I just listed, they were doing. But then people in other parts of the district said, how come those schools get that position and we don't? So the district made an attempt to create more equity by creating zones. And that became difficult. So then they created another model for the community schools coordinator. So the notion that people are out to get, I think, is incorrect, because I think what's happened is we've tried very hard to hold on to a position that at one point in time was funded by an external grant. And for many, many years, I mean, it's been, I think, over a decade since that grant ended. So, you know, one of the things that I think is so key about this recommendation, and I don't like using the word reduction because I think we're actually just moving positions to different places. We're not reducing staff numbers, is hearing about the support for our priority learners early in the school year and how important that is to the success of those students who struggle in school. Having them start the year off with adults in the building that are there to be able to help them from the very beginning is so key. And the use of the child and youth family support workers and the outreach workers to go out and get those students in the building. We need the kids in the buildings to be able to benefit from the services we can provide. So, you know, I have a great affinity and love for the original use of the community schools coordinators and everything people have tried to do, but I also, you know, keep in my mind that we can do, what's the term? We can do anything we want, we can't do everything we want. And we have a mandate to make sure that we are improving student achievement, and we're in a pandemic and we have kids who have not been in school and will not have been in school for 18 months. So having said that, here's my question. What I would like to see presented to us is where SD 68 stands in terms of the 4 buckets of ministry. I'm having a bit of a tough time with my word right now. Spending, the spending categories of instruction, administration, operations, and transportation. So there's our percentage of spending, and then there's provincial averages, and I'm okay with us being outside of averages because we're unique. So what I would like to see, if it's, and I didn't see it, and I apologize if I didn't, but I'd like to see where SD 68 stands in comparison to the provincial averages around instruction, administration, operations, and transportation. And if we don't have it today, I'm happy to wait for it and have it presented at another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Higginson. Secretary Treasurer Walsh.
So, through Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. I look forward to responding to that question at the Education Committee on Wednesday, if that is acceptable.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I see that Trustee Higginson has gone off screen, but do you require a follow-up, Trustee Higginson?
Nope, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So moving down the list, the next we have is Mr. Zveer.
I don't know if I can get on the video, but let me see. There we go. I think I'm on. Well, part of it's a comment, part of it's a question, because, you know, we're looking, as I said, about $198,000 to, you know, keep 4 positions in there. And we talked about a 23% increase TAs. That's not a 23% increase TAs. That's a contingency fund. So let's be very careful. It's not 23%. It sounds like we're getting all these EAs. But if you look at the CUPE staffing change, there is 3.385 taken out of COVID. So if you really look at the increase, it's not 7.45, it's not 23%, it's the overall arching. We're losing people from COVID funding, so we're going to be down. It's in an area what's required. My part is I look at a growing school district. I look at needs of people that are working in the district and take these jobs as a possibility of keeping their career path going. Somebody says, you know, maybe through attrition or people make changes, some things could come about. But to ask somebody to go from a 12-month job at 33 hours back into a possibly 26.5 or 26-hour to 29.5-hour job for less than 9 months of the year is quite a reduction. And saying that somebody may choose to go into a new career. The school meals planners may not have a choice of where they can go because there may not be positions open to them. So there is a definite impact to staffing conditions. Some of these jobs, when there's multiple places to land on, but through attrition, because people retire and stuff, have very greater demands on meeting the ability to keep employed and stay within the district. We have probably, I'm going to say, 40 retirees this year. It's a huge number. And if you take their vacation time that the district has to pay out in lieu of what they have coming in the backside of it, yes, people move up the trend. There's probably $30,000 to $50,000 in savings right there that is already in the budget that can be applied. It's just finding the will to say, yes, I think we can make this happen. It's very hard to tell somebody that your career path has been upended when you're in a growing school district. Presentations only happen when we have to make those tough cuts. I don't plan on presenting because I don't peg one class of QP against the other to say I want to keep something over something else. I'm about all. Can we maintain it? Can we roll it over? And how do I balance? And yes, there's changes that need to be happening. Sometimes the changes happen at attrition. Sometimes they happen because there's another way to shift it. My question is, why at this time do we need to make such changes to certain people's lives? It's my question. I do believe we have the funding.
Thank you, Mr. Spear. I'm not sure that Mr. Walsh can answer that, but I'll give him a shot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, and appreciate it. Just I guess I would say that to the points that the superintendent and the deputy superintendent made about the impacts of COVID, kids that have not, we're going to have a whole cohort of students that hasn't necessarily even socialized with other kids for their youth, and so now that complexity is coming to our classrooms. The other thing, of course, is that, you know, and I know the educators are making the recommendations, but one thing I can also say as someone that's been marching through the process is that the thing that we hear consistently is the need for increased EAs. And so I guess what I would say is that if we had the ability to find some extra dollars, indeed, we would probably come back to the board and recommend more COIFSWs or EAs at this point as well. So I see everyone else on the screen, so I just thank you. And I just, again, I want to express appreciation for the comments of our partners at QP.
I see both Superintendent Saywell and Deputy Superintendent. Hopefully I got your title right, Mr. Davey, on the screen.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Chair. Just quickly, just at the end there, Secretary Treasurer Walsh sort of stole my thunder a little bit. I think the board wants us to bring information to them that we feel best allocates the resources in the district to improve outcomes for students. And so that's what we've brought this evening. And so if the board looks at that and they think they can go a different route, I appreciate Mr. Severe, and he's doing his members well this evening. That's his job. He does it well. If the board believes there's some other way to do this, then they can ask staff to investigate that. Right now, we've brought this forward as the best way to improve outcomes for kids in a pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Saywell. Did Deputy Superintendent Davey wish to respond as well?
Thank you, and I appreciate the conversation. So through you, Chair, there's just a couple of points I want to make here, and this has been noted already, but the importance of adding an increase of staffing to support the classrooms at this point. We've heard this, through our partners who are sitting at the table, through the business committee this evening, through the unions. But speaking to the point of educational assistant, support staff, contingency, and having this flexibility, there are some points that I wanted to bring forward for consideration of the members of the business committee this evening. And really what we're looking at here, as we're all fully aware, we've got increased community needs, and we know that these needs of our community are playing out in our classrooms on a daily basis right now. We know that this is going to be an increased focus as we go forward here coming into the new school year. Community resources and services, as we're again fully aware, that support students and families have been significantly disrupted due to the COVID pandemic. We as a system, as a school system here, have to be nimble and responsive to our students and the needs that are presented in our classrooms, in our schools. Another piece here that I think is important, and again, this speaks to the needs of having additional supports within our school classrooms here. We have a cohort of preschool students who, for many, if not the majority, have not been able to attend preschool, and will be entering into our schools without what we would perceive to be readiness skills that they would have picked up through their preschooling years. So this is going to be, again, another important aspect for adding staff into our classrooms. We have a few hundred students, as we've already discussed this evening here, who are returning to bricks and mortar schools from our DL program, from Island Connect Ed, from homeschooling programs. Hopefully we'll have students that are returning back to our school system, back to Nanaimo-Leedston Public Schools. We don't know what that education's been like for those students, but we know when they come back that it's our obligation, our job, to be supporting those students in the classroom. We also have students, as we have heard throughout this year, who through outreach supports have been given opportunity to maybe not be in our bricks and mortar schools, but who have been supported in other ways, either through the transition learning program, or at this point in time, we have staff that are reaching out to support students through outreach programs. Hopefully, again, many of these students will be returning to our classrooms, but I want to emphasize again the impact, as has been pointed out, and Trustee Stanley spoke to, the impact of trauma that's going to be present come September through this pandemic. I'll conclude here just by making a statement that I heard today, and I think this is also important. I don't know what it's going to look like in September in terms of where we're at. We presume that we're going to be in a stage where our students are returning to school. I don't know what the border is going to look like, but if the borders are open, we have been informed through our partners at the Multicultural Society, Vancouver Island Multicultural Society, that we could be looking at an influx of upwards of 40 immigrant families who are arriving into our community over the summer months. And again, I'll just point out that the more supports that we have in the classroom or in our schools, in those classrooms, the better at this point in time. And that's where the recommendations are coming forward. I started off by outlining that educational assistance and outreach supports, both in terms of professional teaching staff and other supports, child and family support workers, is what we're looking at as a recommendation coming forward. So thank you. And through the chair, I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davey. Mr. Zveer, do you require a follow-up?
Yeah. Well, my follow-up is that, and it sounds like we're going to have, all these extra people coming in, they bring funding. We're talking 4 jobs, and it sounds like we're building it off of 20 or 30. So my question really is, focus on the fact, 4 jobs. It's 195,000. It's not about changing anything else. Everything they're talking about is right. How would I stand up and say more resources is not good? And that's why my presentation on Wednesday night is not about splitting QP up. It's about trying to maintain what we have and grow forward without the reduction of somebody else that takes their job and pride with the school district and have been doing it for very many years. That is why the question is, can we find the money? Not changing anything. Is there an ability to find the money within? I've given some ideas. That's all I can say. So my question is, how did 4 jobs become something like 40 kids impacted? I don't believe that was what I was asking. So.
Thank you, Mr. Zveer. I'm next on the list. So my question to staff is, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you for the budget information. I really appreciate the way it was presented this year. It's easy to understand. It's clear what the recommendations were, so thank you for that. My question is around the 4 positions that are identified for changes in the budget. And, you know, ideally, I think if we all had the choice, we would like to see more adults in the classroom supporting our students in their learning. But I'm wondering if the board wanted to maintain these positions, how might we do that? And I'm wondering if we could learn a little bit more about what that might look like at some point along the way in this budget cycle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Shall I respond maybe at least a little bit at this time?
Yeah, I wouldn't expect a fulsome response at this time, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. It's more of a request or a comment, if you will. Is from my perspective, I would like to see, as an individual trustee, at least what that might look like for the board to make a decision on.
Yes, maybe we can I could respond now in general terms, if that would be helpful, or we can respond a little bit more specific on Wednesday. I'm not sure what you.
My apologies, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. I'm not meaning to put you on the spot at this point. Maybe I'll leave that with you to.
Sorry, no, I can respond. So, but I guess maybe what would be helpful too is that when we're talking about the increase in the contingency, and accept Mr. Zveer's point that it's, you know, it's not a ton of positions, but the impact is intended to be outsized, really, in hopefully having supports in September. But the additional FTE is also supported by cuts to supplies and services and learning budgets within the Department of Learning Services budget as well. So it's not a 1-for-1, or a 4 for 7.5. It's a 4 plus additional reductions that are just not associated with people. They might be supports for people though, but they're not associated with people. So one of the ways the board, if they wanted to go the direction, would be to use surplus funds, either anticipating surplus now using restricted dollars, and we don't recommend that because, again, we're talking using restricted dollars for an ongoing budget purpose. And again, if the trustees said, okay, well, if we want to use all those restricted funds, I'm thinking staff would probably come with a different recommendation in any event. We could, of course, not increase the EA contingency or increase it less. So those are kind of immediate responses. To Mr. Zveer's point, there is something, so when we pay benefits on a yearly basis, some years, you know, as we do in all of our budgeting, we make sure that we're going to always be able to cover our liabilities, and so we might pay a little bit more into that, into the benefits package, and then so at the end of the year there might be a little bit of a surplus, and then at the end of 5 years there might be even more surplus that is built up, and we theoretically could access that again. And I don't have the number with me, but again, we're talking one-time savings. And if the board was to ask again staff what the recommendation to meet the board's goals, it probably wouldn't necessarily be that. So I can come up with certainly some more specifics, but if the board directed us to find $198,000 out of the current operating budget, we would say have less EA contingency, is that's where it's being paid from, or we could come up with some alternatives, but then it would impact other positions or services.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. Moving on down the list, the next on our speakers list is Trustee Barron.
Thank you, Chair. I find myself reflecting as I'm listening to everybody speak about the fact that we're all speaking quite passionately, not all of us, but we're all speaking, our outcome, our intended outcome here is the same, which is really interesting to me. We're all saying the same things of our intended goal, but I'm hearing different ways of how we might get there. And so I just want to stop and appreciate that for a moment, that we have a board with diverse opinions and are hearing different things from the community perhaps, but I do appreciate that we all want to see increased outcomes for students. We all want to see, our students getting the education that they deserve. And so I just really appreciate that. I just wanted to, because it sounds like now is an opportunity for us to speak to this a little bit more. And so I definitely want to take that opportunity to speak to the document that I have here, the 2-page information sheet that we received on March the 3rd, did provide some information. I don't have the equivalent of this for the, I believe they're called the school meals planners. So I don't have, although I hear we'll be receiving that information, so perhaps I could speak more to that once received. But right now, all I have is the community schools, the bit of information that was presented to us to speak to. And since we are talking about this, and since we are looking at the potential of cutting 2 positions from the community schools program, I think it is important for us to discuss a little bit more thoroughly this information sheet that I don't believe was thoroughly discussed. One thing that I noticed, I just wanted to point out, I did a little bit of research into the districts that currently do have community school coordinators. And I'm seeing that we have SD 70, Pacific Rim, SD 71, Comox Valley, SD 62, Souk, SD 61, Victoria. Those are just a few of the districts that are currently utilizing the community schools program to meet the needs, in particular right now during a pandemic. It's interesting to me as well when we look at our strategic plan around safe, caring, and healthy schools, and how our community schools program in itself is directly in line with the strategic plan that we have put together. Us trying to increase resources closer to the classroom, I agree. And actually, it's funny because all of these things that we're talking about, when I hear them, I think, oh, that's exactly what community schools programming does. Community schools programming, when they were well supported and working to their full potential, for every $1 that was invested in a community school coordinator, they brought in $3 that went directly into students, that were invested into students. It's actually, when supported, community school coordinators were actually in an investment in the actual wage that they were provided. They were actually bringing in more. So that's just an interesting thing for us to consider, the potential of what could happen if this program was well supported. The other thing I wanted to point out was that community schools, when supported, they work with increasing student learning, increasing integrated services, increasing community engagement, all through grant writing and collaborations and partnerships, through donations. There's ample ways in which community school coordinators bring in resources and partnerships and direct services for students, so that when those students are seated in the seat, they're provided with the best possible opportunity to learn, which actually, if you think about it, would reduce the need for the reactionary supports. And so it all fits together to actually to provide direct resources in the classroom. And so I just wanted to respond to a few of those things that were discussed in the report prior to us going into budget, because I do believe so passionately in us taking a proactive approach in ensuring that our students are provided with the best possible educational opportunities. And I just wouldn't feel right leaving this meeting without having an opportunity to mention some of my thoughts around that, and hope that we can consider these points when we're moving into the budget, and the potential of us finding the money to be able to continue to support these positions that are and have been an essential part of our school district for generations. Thanks for allowing me to speak, Chair.
Thank you, Trustee Barron. So what I'm going to do here is allow Trustee Higginson and then Trustee Stanley to speak. So go ahead, Trustee Higginson.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is actually maybe in preparation again, another question I have that would be great to see is around our graduation rates. So one sort of, again, comparing them to the provincial average, and it's not because I want us to, you know, compare ourselves to someone else. Well, I guess I am asking us to compare ourselves to the provincial average, but it's for us to try to understand how the budget recommendations will help us if there's a gap between us and the provincial average. So in the updated information that we get coming up, I'd love to see our 6-year rates, our special needs rates, and our Indigenous rates compared to the provincial average, and also specifically have maybe someone address my concern, maybe my question now if they can, but if not, it can be in the future, is when I look at our Indigenous grad rates, there seems to kind of be like a plateauing thing happening. We're kind of stuck either in the mid 60s, the high 60s, and I'm wondering if someone agrees with me on that, and if not, you know, what is our strategy in this budget to see those achievement rates increase? Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Higginson. Would someone from staff like to come on and respond to that? It looks like Superintendent Saywell would like to respond.
Yeah, thank you. Through you, Chair. There were a couple questions there. The first one was around our grad rates and how we compare. We've been about 10% under the provincial average. We've closed that gap a little bit. I believe the provincial average for the 6-year grad rate now is 91%. We're up to 84. Island districts are significantly, as a collection, are significantly below the provincial average, and we've grappled with why that is. We typically have higher Indigenous populations, and those grad rates are lower, so that may be one of the reasons. I don't think we're plateauing. I think we're improving. I think what happened this last year is we went down just a tiny bit with our Indigenous grad rate because of COVID, and we know that our most vulnerable populations are affected more so during this pandemic. So we're hoping coming out of this we can get back on track to improving those rates. Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Saywell. Trustee Higginson, do you require a follow-up?
No, I appreciate the answer. I do think it would be an important piece of information to have in the overall budget document, to sort of where we are on the provincial average and how the budget recommendations are addressing those concerns, only because you know, this is why we're here at the board level, to make those really important nuanced decisions that affect our local context that we're in. And so recognizing those contexts and then addressing them through our budget decisions, I think, is a key aspect of why the board exists.
Thank you, Trustee Higginson. So just looking at the time here, it's 8 o'clock. I think it would be a good time to take a 5-minute recess and reconvene. Let people give people a chance to stretch and meet back here at about 5 after 8. Does that work for everyone?
Chair?
Yes. Trustee O'Neill.
Sorry, I just wondered, I'm not sure because this process is kind of new given our virtual meetings, but I can't help but note that Trustee Stanley's on the list.
Yes.
Okay.
We'll come back to Trustee Stanley and then I'm after her, and I'm not sure how many speakers we'll have following. So I know that I need a quick recess, and I will be, I guess if we could just meet back here at 5 after 8, that would be great. Mr. Burgos, are you able to accommodate that, or do we need to keep moving here?
I'll just mute everyone's mic if you want to just turn your camera off for now, Trustee Keller.
take about 1 more minute and then we'll call the meeting back to order. Okay, thank you everybody. We'll call the meeting back to order and we'll move down the speakers list to our next speaker, Trustee Stanley.
Hi, thank you, Chair. Hope everybody's back. I'm going to assume the staff is back, so I'm going to ask a question. That's funny, I was realizing this. I think the 2 previous trustee comments, somewhat similar to my own. I'm aware that, you know, to staff, thank you for all this budget information. You've done so much work on such a wide variety of perspectives that, you know, underlies everything we do. And now the conversation has come down to 4 positions largely, but that kind of reflects the kind of heartbreaking pieces that we're having to consider right now. And from my perspective, at the core of considerations is, you know, a preventative perspective versus remediation in a pandemic. These are not decisions. It's a Sophie's choice, I guess it feels like. So I don't want it to underscore the work that staff did, and there's a number of efficiencies that was mentioned earlier that I think is impressive work, so that want that to be acknowledged as well. But I also want to thank staff for this conversation because it has been really informative in this process, and I think that's really useful. I do have 2 questions. So one is with regards to the school meal planner positions, and at the core of my considerations is that preventative piece. So I don't know if we have the information now, but I would like to get a little bit of information about what needs that those positions meet. How vulnerable are students in that area? Do we need to prioritize? You know, assuming, you know, I don't have the job description, so I'm making assumptions right now. So job descriptions really matter, but to what extent does this meet a necessary need of students to ensure that they have nutrition so they can function in our schools? That's one question. The other one would be, and again, I don't, you know, somewhere in this process, I'm hoping to get this information. The other one is a really interesting piece to consider was about the percentage of students, preschool, you know, incoming kindergartners, and how many have not actually been in a preschool. And I'm wondering if there's any research on that. Do we know what percentages of preschool students that are coming into K that have not attended preschool? Just wanting those pieces of information to kind of for my consideration in this process.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. Who would like to take this one? Perhaps Secretary Treasurer Walsh or Deputy Superintendent Davey?
Thank you. I think Ms. Deputy Superintendent will be able to respond.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. Great questions.
Sorry to interrupt you, Deputy Superintendent. We can't hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, and I was just commenting. Great questions, and I do appreciate what you're bringing forward. Trustee Stanley, so what I will say is that I do not have response at this time, but I will certainly ascertain to get that and bring this back to the table for the next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Superintendent Davey. Do you require any follow-up, Trustee Stanley? No. Okay. I'm next on the list, and actually before I go, I'll just ask any trustees who haven't had a chance to speak, please let me know if you would like to go ahead. I don't see anybody. Okay. So my question is a little bit different topic, and I believe that the report touched on this a little bit, and I was hoping that staff could expand a little bit about the impact that the COVID funding is having on the budget, and what that discussion might look like. And I'm not sure if this will happen on Wednesday or at some point along the line in our budget deliberations, but specifically with respect to maintaining cleaning levels and any of the kind of COVID related expenses that are no longer covered with the provincial and federal COVID response funds or relief funds. And specifically just knowing at this point that there are some unknowns. We don't know what September is going to bring, and you know, I'm not sure what the plan is. At what point do we have to make a decision, if not during the budget process, if we're coming, say, closer to September and we're not back to a place, you know, back to normal, whatever that looks like at this point?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Chair, I think I can respond to that. So with respect to the impact from COVID specifically, I think page 32 is one area to look for the numbers, as well as in perhaps even page 24 is better. And so 24 will show you all of the various positions associated with COVID funding that will be removed from the budget. And again, this was all anticipated when the funds came out because they were intended to be temporary. But, so I will say, maybe we'll look at it in two ways. So one is the staffing implications. And so you recall there was a great deal of movement from bricks and mortar to Island Connect Ed or to homeschooling. And one of the things that the COVID funding did for us this year is it allowed us to maintain, and I know people will disagree with the statement, but with artificially low class sizes in our bricks and mortar as kids didn't show up or they went out to ice. And so we're able to support those kids without having to shake up our schools in September. So that's fairly big. Also, of course, the board supported a transition program where we were supporting kids kind of outside of both of those bricks and mortar or DL. We are not anticipating either one of those things at this point. So, and frankly, even with the contingency that the ministry has set aside and the board's letter that they write, I'm not sure you'd be requesting those funds because we should really have an idea what school is going to look like in September and how many kids are going to be there. So in September, if the government says cohorts must be maintained all the time, this could be different, but let's say 20 kids less show up in September. Well, maybe that's one less division that we're going to be planning on, and there needs to be some movement in schools. So there's that kind of staffing issue that's there. So we don't have funding for that. The board could look to its contingency, its staffing contingency in extraordinary circumstances. So say a school doesn't get half the kids it thought it was going to get, and we've got all these staff, could look to that. The main area, though, of expenditure, and the one that we are reviewing and the one that we've mentioned in our report, is the $1.5 million approximately that we anticipate spending for next year associated with increased cleaning protocols that are pretty much what they are now, because the Ministry of Education hasn't told us what it would look like differently in September. We haven't included those in the budget, of course, because then we'd be coming to the board and saying, well, we actually have to cut $1.5 million from somewhere else to pay it. And we don't think that's realistic. Number one, because we do think we're going to have some surplus at the end of the year. And number two, because we don't think that that will be the level of service required. And number three, if it is the level of service required, we would anticipate the government would use their kind of discretionary COVID funds to support whatever requirements they had at schools. And there's no promises out there, but it would seem unreasonable to put a requirement on a school district to do something and then not support it. So we've envisioned the daytime custodian, additional daytime custodians that are currently existing, the additional spraying in the evenings, the supplies that are going to go with them, etc., to come up with that approximately $1.5 million. We don't want the board to make a decision right away because that could look very different in September, right? We're hearing more and more that touch surfaces are not really as impactful perhaps as they originally thought in the pandemic. So maybe we're not spraying as much, but we need to wait for our medical health professionals to give us guidance on that front. So in the end of June, we're going to know our surplus. Hopefully soon thereafter or even before, we'll know how the vaccinations have gone, and the ministry will give us direction as to what September startup looks like and either support us with funds or we come to the board and say, here board, we told you to be ready. There's a surplus, but we need to use X percentage of that surplus to support cleaning. So I'm sorry for that incredibly long response, but I hope it's responsive and helpful.
No, that was, thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. That was very helpful. Just to paraphrase what I think I heard, just so I understand fully. So as I understand it, with respect to specifically the additional cleaning protocols, it's not in the budget at this time. However, once we get to June and know what our what's left in the budget, if we have any surplus, at that time, the board will be asked to make a decision based on what the ministry comes back with respect to funding any additional expenses that are required.
The timing, through Mr. Chair, the timing might be a little bit later with respect with when the decision is actually made, but yes. So June 30 is our last day of our fiscal. Then we start doing our audit to determine what our surplus is. And then normally we come to the board in late August or September to talk about where the surplus allocation would go. And then we would come at that time with what the recommendation and the plan is. Given, if the ministry gives us funding, we may not need to do that and we can wait for the normal September timeline. If not, we would have to come to the board and say, okay, we want to use this money on this cleaning regime.
Great, thank you. Just, we've really heard a lot of positives, very positive things from the community with respect to the cleanliness of our facility. So it'd be a shame to see that go prematurely. Thank you. So moving on, I see that Trustee McKay is on the list, and I'm going to go to her first and then to Trustee Barron.
Thank you, Chair. So question for staff. Hopefully I can phrase this well. So previously we've received some information from Director of Instruction Cadwallader regarding literacy rates in K-9, and that showed us some trends that have caused me to ask some more questions around literacy rates in elementary schools and moving into secondary schools in particular. And so given those given that information, I guess I'm wondering what questions have we asked to find out whether or not Tier 3 literacy interventions might be required, and was there any consideration given to increasing Tier 3 level literacy supports in the budget? And if we haven't considered it for the operating budget, are staff giving any thought to what that might look like if there are any surplus funds beyond COVID needs to providing Tier 3, possibly Tier 2 level interventions for literacy?
I see that Superintendent Saywell's come on the screen. Would you like to respond, Scott?
Yeah, thanks. Through you, Mr. Chair. I can't adequately respond. I can take that away and next Wednesday, Assistant Superintendent of Elementary, Laura Tate, would be with us. And I'm not sure if Deputy Superintendent can respond to this evening. Maybe if you could come on the screen for a second, Tim. Otherwise, we'll take that away, Trustee McKay, Chair McKay, whoever you are.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, Superintendent, no further comments to add at this point, but I think we, as you mentioned, we'll take this away and make sure that we have adequate response. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And do you have a follow-up? Oh, she's disappeared off the screen. I just confirm. And before you go, Trustee McKay, you said you had a couple of questions. Would you like me to add you back to the list? No, thank you. Okay. So moving on, I just want to confirm one thing before we jump to Trustee Barron. Sorry, Trustee Barron. Make sure I'm not missing Trustee Higginson. Did you get a chance to ask your question, Trustee Higginson?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and now it's off to Trustee Barron.
Thank you, Chair. It's my last question, I promise. I was hoping I could get some clarification, please, on page 17 around the classroom enhancement fund. I'm just curious. My understanding was that the classroom enhancement fund was to be used specifically for, areas within the classroom, specifically around the ruling around class size and composition. And when I was looking at it, I found myself questioning, how does this role pertain to what I thought was the intended purpose of the CEF funding? And I'm just wondering if you could clarify a little bit how those roles, some of them look like they fit a little outside of that, and how they fit within that funding stream, and if I have a clear understanding of that funding stream.
Sure. So through you, Mr. Chair. So on page 17, the Classroom Enhancement Fund outlines the staffing expenses and then the overhead expenses. And so the staffing expenses with respect to elementary, secondary, and ELL, elementary and secondary will be associated with class size and composition requirements, and ELL with respect to ratios. When you look at the overhead, though, so this has actually dropped over the last number of years. Lucky that the number is maintained. So the idea is that this district is one of the larger recipients of CEF. So you're hiring more teachers, you're opening more classrooms, dozens and dozens and dozens of them. And so with that, strictly due to the increased number of staffing, you need a district, principal of HR to help with hiring, to help with the actual implementation. So how are we talking with our partners about remedy? How are we dealing with classroom composition, district vice principal, and you'd also be again with the TTOC hires and making sure that there's appropriate supports, etc. HR managers, very similar. We're having more EA support. Well, we're having more people coming on board. So the idea was at the get-go is we need to go and hire like mad to fill all these classes. And so here's a whole bunch of supports. And then as you start looking down, you're like, caretakers. Well, it makes sense because how many new classrooms did we get and how many classrooms are maintained on a yearly basis strictly because of the CEF. And so that they're there to support, the various plans, like the plumber and the gas fitter and the electrician. That was probably more upfront, but by this point, you want to maintain those supports. I guess it could be reallocated, but then we'd have to, find the funds for those permanent jobs from another pot. So I hope that is responsive to that.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer. I had to think about that for a minute. Walsh, do you require a follow-up, Trustee Barron?
No, thank you, Chair. That answers my question. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer.
Thank you. So next on our list is Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. So I just want to circle back to the comment about the improved cleaning funds, and I appreciate the response in terms of the cost, the health and safety guidelines that may have costs associated with them. But something that we may want to think about here is that there were a number of things implemented this year that actually improved the health of our buildings and may not cost anything. Things like, you know, the increased hand washing, staying home when we're sick. So there's a lot of things that we can do and we can encourage that have no cost related to them. I know that in my son's classrooms, they're cleaning the classroom more than they have been before. So I think it might be interesting for us to think about those types of things that we would like to see continue, even without outside of the possibility of increased health and safety measures that have no cost to us. And that was just a comment. Thanks.
Thanks, Trustee Higginson. I see that Secretary Treasurer Walsh was wanting to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to be clear that the increased hand washing has actually been fairly expensive for the school district. I'm not suggesting that we don't encourage that, but paper towels in this inflationary environment are pretty costly. It's probably getting time to come back to the board and talk about how our absenteeism, our sick leave use is going, because despite the fact that we don't have flus, we still seem to have, I think it's been pretty good, but it's been relatively consistent year to year on a sick leave basis. So we'll probably maybe come back with a post, what's the way to say that without using that word? And after the pandemic review of some of those expenses, just to report out.
Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Walsh. Trustee Higginson, did you want to follow up?
No, but I love that moment of clarity. Thank you for reminding us about the increased cost of hand washing. Thank you.
Definitely not something I would have thought of myself, so thank you for that information. I'm next on the list. I have a question perhaps for Secretary Treasurer Walsh or others. I'm just wondering if on Wednesday or at some other point in this process for our budget this year, if we'll learn a little bit more about the impact on the community school coordinator program, if of the elimination of the two positions and sort of how the program would be structured, because I know that we have portfolios right now and I'm just not quite clear on how that would change. And I guess the same would go with the food service workers as well and how that would work.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, and that may be for Mr. Davey to come and respond on Wednesday or this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to you also, Mr. Chair. Thank you, and what I will do is work with staff members of the Department of Living Services to bring forward information on Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davey and Secretary Treasurer Walsh. And I don't see anybody else on our speakers list, so thank you, staff, for all the excellent work that you put together and responding to a number of questions this evening. Very much appreciated. Oh, I see Secretary Treasurer Walsh back on the screen here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you could indulge me, I'd just like Ms. Sutton, if she could pop on and just say a word so the screen can capture her.
Please.
Yeah, you have to say something, Tanya.
Oh, sorry. Hello.
Okay. Okay. Well, I just wanted to express appreciation for all of the work that Ms. Sutton and her team have done, again, in preparing this budget, but also we've set some very good internal processes together and done some great education this year for stakeholders as well as internal folks, and I just really wanted to say thank you and express appreciation for that work. So I might be doing the talking, but she's doing the work. Let's just say that. So thank you so much.
Team effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton and Mr. Walsh and everyone that's been involved. So thank you. So So we will move on in the agenda. I believe the next item sorry, I can't speak anymore this evening, our question period. Ms. Matthews, do we have any questions this evening? Don't see any. Seeing none. Okay, well, that pretty much wraps up. Can I get a motion to adjourn? Moved by Trustee Stanley and seconded by Trustee O'Neill. Anyone opposed to adjournment this evening? Hearing none, the meeting's adjourned. Thank you again, everybody.